Hello, it's good to be here with you today with Tyler, a Lutheran pastor, Tim, a United Church minister, and myself, Gwen, an Anglican priest. Today I wanted to ask or talk about Christianity and why we have anything to do with it, given some of the awful things associated with it. So Christianity has a spotty history, as we know, in many places as a religion that forcibly and sometimes violently displaced the culture and faith of people that had long lived in those or these places. And then there's all that enforced patriarchy, the repression of sexuality, and especially queer sexuality, the teaching of passive obedience to power. There are a lot of reasons to be suspicious of Christianity as it has played out in our world. So my question today is, given the sins of Christianity, have you ever wanted to walk away or walked away? Have you ever been an atheist or not a Christian?
Oh, I'll start by giving my general answer to that. Have I ever considered myself an atheist or not a Christian? I would say I'm a Christian about 51% of the time, which is sort of just enough, I feel. Because, when we're honest with ourselves, the amount of doubt and struggle and frustration, of heartbreak and all that, it does weigh on the soul and the spirit, and there certainly is an urge to walk away. That being said, I never have, not since I sort of became a Christian, but we can talk about that later. But I never have walked away from it.
Thank you.
I would say in my experience, I'm a cradle Lutheran. I've been part of the Christian tradition my whole life, surrounded by pastors and church people. I'm drawn to the ideals of Christianity, what Jesus stood for, and I've over time been put off by lots of the dogmatic pieces of the broader Christendom piece, the institution that came out of the Christian movement, the early Christian movement. I've been put off by things in my broader church as well as my local church on occasion. And when I say local church, I mean wherever I've been at different times in my life, because I've lived in BC, Saskatchewan, now Manitoba. So I resonate with what Tim says about being 51% Christian. I have certainly been part of the tradition, part of the movement, and happy to be so, but have wondered about things along the way too.
I'm interested to ask more about that, but before that, so Tyler, you grew up Lutheran. And Tim, how about you?
Well, I guess I in theory grew up United, but like my family, we went to church. We weren't quite C&E Christian, Christmas and Easter Christians, but we weren't every week, as I recall anyway. It really wasn't until I moved overseas that I sort of became independently Christian, I guess. My family around the margins, but it's when I moved overseas. I should say I grew up in Hong Kong, and so when I lived there, I started attending the Lutheran church connected with my school, and it was through the Lutheran church there that I sort of got connected and started exploring my faith. My high school was also a Christian, had a bit of a Christian pedagogy to it, and so that added to my own personal exploration. And then when I came back to university in Ontario, in Guelph, I kind of walked away from it. But I guess I still maintain my Christianity. I don't want to mix this up with Christianity and church, so I'm trying to keep those two separate. because I think while they're connected, they are kind of different. So I walked away from it, but then, I just started exploring deeper and deeper and deeper, and my theology and my faith in Christianity began to grow and grow and grow. But I mean, it ebbs and flows, right? It's like, and it's not just, I only half believe. Sometimes I'm like full wholehearted into it, and other times I'm really, really not. And so when I say that 51%, it's sort of like, I mean, obviously it's a bit tongue in cheek, but it's this sense of, yeah, I'll have weeks, months, years when I've been in ministry when it's like, geez, I'm really struggling with all this and I don't know what I'm doing with it. And I don't know why I'm doing it. And so that would be just to flush that out a little bit more. I'm curious what your answer is Gwen.
Well, I'm wondering if my more extreme reaction against Christianity for about 10 years, my 20s, I would say I didn't want to be associated with Christianity because of all the negative things about it. I'm wondering if that has to do with the fact that I didn't grow up Anglican. I grew up in a sort of born again, charismatic, home church, non-denominational kind of thing. And that's not all bad, but there's certainly some really bad things about it. I think some really harmful things about that culture, the culture around it, which is extremely conformist. So it's like either you believe all these things and follow all these rules exactly as they are, or you can't be a person of faith at all. Then you're separated from God. And those were the options. And it was highly demanding. And I was kind of a super achiever about it as a youth, good fundamentalist, good and judgmental on myself and others. But I was watching friends of mine who weren't able to conform to that for various reasons. One friend, for example, was gay, came out as gay to me. And as I was watching people who weren't able to conform to it, I was realizing I loved them just as much. I didn't think it was a problem. Their lives were not less healthy because of it. And they seemed happy. And I started to realize there was something really wrong with the way I was seeing the world and the way that I'd really embraced in seeing the world. So maybe it's partly my reaction. Partly I didn't want to be associated with any of that. I didn't know there was any other options. I grew up hearing that, Catholics were pagans essentially, and, United Church, Lutheran, and all those, they were more just social clubs that people weren't very committed in them, right? Or their lives weren't really changed by them. Go ahead.
Your statement of like sort of having this youthful conservatism in your Christianity, that rings true for me as well.
Oh, really?
So yeah, very much so. So when I said I started exploring it on my own through my high school and through Lutheran church, the Lutheran church was pretty good. But in my high school, I mean, I was 14, 15, 16. It was sort of my my child rebellion, I guess. Like a lot of people rebelled. I had another friend who put it, yeah, Christianity was my teenage rebellion, which is kind of the worst rebellion ever, but it is what it was, right? And so my family, which was not overly religious, they appreciated the social aspect of it to a point, but the theology of it, they weren't a part of. So I really latched onto a very conservative theology. And it was a similar thing. I was in high school and I was taking a religion class, and, someone else in that class, I can't remember what it was about. It was either looking at Paul or Mark or something. And someone had said, yeah, I mean, we're all such awful people and God is so wonderful. And we're very fortunate that, if we're Christian, that God is graceful enough to love us, even though we don't deserve it. And that, when that was said, that was sort of my first, something inside of me kicked and said, well, wait a minute, what? That doesn't ring true for me either, because it was an odd thing going to an international school with a conservative Christian bent when a significant portion of the student population and a great number of my friends were not Christian. And
Mhm.
so that I was like, well, wait, so is so-and-so going to hell? And I just started putting those pieces together that just didn't reconcile with the idea of a loving God. And so that was sort of my journey out of that way of seeing. But I resonate with the idea of having a quite a conservative bent to it. Yeah.
Mhm. Tyler, did you grow up? I think you might be the odd one out on this. Did you grow up quite conservative at any point, or no?
Well, I grew up in BC on Vancouver
Mm.
Island. And I would say that I kind of hid my faith life from friends. It's not that I was sort of actively like stepping into a corner or something as soon as the topic came up, just so I wouldn't have to address it or anything. It was just they didn't go to church. I did. And it didn't really have any connection to life outside. Church was church. And then I did school and I did work stuff or other life stuff. And I think in a way, my parents, my dad's a pastor. I think it would have been he and sort of my mom and the older generation, at least from my experience, that had gone through some of the need to differentiate an older version of the faith that their parents, that my dad's parents would have had, versus what my dad was trying to live into himself and then pass along to us kids. Because I found there was openness in a lot of it. That even though we would go to church and sing older hymns and we would say fairly old liturgical language stuff, when we talked about what that meant, there was still a fair bit of openness in it. Even to a degree of openness to LGBT people, openness to expressions of sexuality, although I will say we didn't talk about that. But had we gone there, it wasn't sort of a, watch what you do kind of message that I was receiving. There was openness there. And so I think that's probably what kept me in the church, at least from my home life and my experience of growing up in the little Lutheran congregation that I grew up in Victoria, BC. I will say that I don't know what your experience of BC is, but there's probably a real openness to just all kinds of expressions of faith and spirituality, to the point that Christianity doesn't come across as dominant as it might more on the prairies. That I've found that a little bit more moving east.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
And so it's true that kids didn't go to church as much, my school chums, but they weren't necessarily saying, well, what church do you go to or what's your spirituality? It was just like not something that was talked about openly in many ways. And the draw to it for me to stay with it was that there was a level of acceptance and affirmation of gifts in the community that I was a part of. It sort of, I love music. So there was lots of opportunity for music there. I love deep conversation, and there was some opportunity for that. Albeit sort of, I would be talking with people who are much older than me usually at church, because there weren't that many kids. But I would say one of the stretching pieces, when I was a young adult, I was a student at University of Victoria. I had a part-time job, and I met somebody there who invited me to their Baptist youth service for a year, and I played in the Baptist youth band. And that was kind of eye-opening for me in terms of engaging what I would say now is a more fundamentalist perspective. And people were welcoming, and they enjoyed what I contributed in terms of music stuff to the band, and the music part was fun. But the theological pieces started to make me ask some questions. And so when I eventually went to seminary, part of what I said in my statement as to, why am I drawn to pursuing this kind of life or these kinds of studies was I said outright to combat fundamentalism was some of where.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Ha. Yeah.
So
Um,
why a Christian? Why stay a Christian? I mean, those things you mentioned about the church, I mean, that's a church. You can find that in lots of places, you know, that sort of acceptance and everything. And these days, Christianity has the image of not being that in many ways. So there's a lot of forces upon us saying, well, you know, don't be Christian anymore.
mm.
Um, and so why specifically, what is it about Christianity that draws you two in? You know,
Mm.
is there anything, what makes these other churches not a social club, as you said, Gwen, or what are those ideals of Christianity specifically, not the church, that you'd mentioned, Tyler?
I mean, I tried not to be Christian
Hmm.
for a while. I think when I hit my 20s, I really wanted to be an atheist. I wanted to be a real rational person. And if I hadn't had, I think the spiritual experiences I'd had, I think I might have succeeded at that, but I couldn't because my experiences were true. So I shuffled along trying not to be Christian, but having one foot in it for for like 10 years. And that was made possible for me. Partly, I took a religion studies class with Carl Ridd at the University of Winnipeg that allowed me to see a very different approach to faith and to Christianity in particular. And then I was involved with the student Christian movement, the SCM, for years and years, and arguably still am in some ways. But that allowed so much room for exploration that I was able to say, well, you know, I'm going to try out this like Wiccan style ceremony, and we're going to go learn from some others. And I got exposed to Lutheran and Anglican ways, didn't get them. um, it had a strong United Church influence, the SCM. And so I got exposed to all that, and I was able to sort of stay partly in it without having to say, yes, I'm in. I was able to be on the margins of Christianity, which is where I was comfortable at that time, and maybe still think that that's a very good place to be. I'm not sure that I didn't get to answering your question, but I want to hear what Tyler says. So.
So why Christianity over atheism or any other tradition, eh? I won't deny the comfort piece. It's something that's familiar. That's part of what I've grown up with. And so there's that. I think when you get to the nuts and bolts of Jesus's life and who he lived with and who he went out to, that resonates for me too now in terms of justice-oriented work. And I don't know other ways that delve into that the same way when you start talking spiritual practice and cultural backgrounds that lead to movements like Hinduism and Buddhism, Sikhism, and all the rest. So, I mean, I think Jesus is somebody that fits for me that way.
So there's two pieces for me, and this is why I ask of you, because I'm curious where it comes from for you. One piece is that sense of incarnation, right? And it's not unique to Christianity, but Christianity at its best, I think, holds up that idea of there's something sacred in the material world, in this world, right? It's not, at its worst, somehow Christianity has become a religion of the next world, which is really ironic to me, because it does seem like it,
Right.
in the Gospels, it's like, here's what holiness looks like in this world. Here's what God looks like in this world. And so that incarnation piece is huge to me. But you do get that in other religions, and in good, wonderful ways. The piece that also makes Christianity step out for me, and this similarly ties into what you were saying there, Tyler, is that the practice by which to encounter it, or where we uniquely encounter, where Christianity emphasizes we uniquely encounter it, is not in the beautiful, not in the wonderful, not in the lovely, not in the easy, but Christianity to me uniquely says, you want to encounter God, or you want to encounter the sacred and know that it's sacred? Well, if you can encounter it in suffering, then you know you're actually encountering sacredness. You're not just encountering your own ego, you're encountering something really truly holy. And so that's where the Christian spiritual practice, and I've said this before, of encountering the suffering comes in. Like that to me is the unique Christian practice, is go to where there is suffering, because that's where you'll meet God and know that it's God, not just a pat on the back from your own ego.
For me, I think what really drew me in was that something new, a new religion, felt kind of like avoidance, where I needed to look the history, not just of Christianity, but of the Western world, right? And that all fitted together. I needed to look that in the face. And when it was probably 29 or 30, I started attending churches, seeing if maybe I wanted to go back to church, and thinking, oh, maybe I didn't. And I really wanted to be a Quaker, ideologically speaking, and it just didn't happen. I ended up getting sucked into an Anglican church. And part of the reason was that there was a lot of Indigenous influence in the particular church I went into. And at that time, they were finally facing, I guess, the legacy of the residential schools. And the fact that that you could, through faith, that the pursuit of faith or the practice of faith could be looking who we are, how we are formed by our history and our culture or cultures, that seemed for me a lot deeper root than if I went broad, if I went somewhere else, you know?
Well, I think that ties into that incarnational aspect of it, right? I mean, it's here. It's not just a willy-nilly practice. Can you look at where you're at and where you come from and who you are and your culture and everything, and can you find God in the midst of that? Am I hearing that right?
No, not just that, but how can you find out who you really are? Mm-hmm. You know, what's really wrong with you that you think is fine, or you know, all the layers, and the prejudice and all of these things that cause so much harm in our world, that is not what we want and not what we profess. But how do you come to realize those? For me, I needed to delve into the faith that formed, you know, the history I grew up in.
Yeah, so that ties into, that's where I'm hearing,
okay.
It resonates with me, because that sense of, you know, what do we think we're fine, but we actually aren't. We need to find a way to put that through some sort of filter in order to figure that out, because we can convince ourselves anything's fine about ourselves, right? Whether it's talking about us as individuals or us as a culture. But when we look in the face of suffering, which, as I said, I think is a Christian spiritual practice, when we go to suffering and let that break us, and can we find something true in the midst of that, then we know it's true, because it's not easy, because we're confronting something challenging and difficult, and
something real.
It's something real. I mean, it's not to say when you go into the natural world and it's beautiful and mountains and serene and sunrise and wonderful, you know, it's not to say that's not holy and sacred. I think it is. That's what I do for my restorative time. But it's kind of easy, you know, and not that religion or Christianity has to be hard, but the way we confirm, like the confirmation that it's not just, because there's a lot of things that are pretty easy that we can say, oh, there's God, or there's holiness, or there's what is good. Yeah, we can convince ourselves of anything, but when we do it in the challenging stuff, then suddenly I think we're touching something a little more true.
Now I want to ask you about what you think about other faiths, but we're out of time for today, so thank you. I really appreciated hearing that from you and talking about those things.
Yeah, thanks, Rose.
If you're okay with it, we'll close with a blessing. And given that I'm talking about delving into facing the tradition, I'll give a very traditional standard blessing from the Anglican faith practice. The peace that passes all understanding, keep your heart and mind in the knowledge and love of God and of Jesus Christ, and the blessing of God Almighty, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit be with you now and evermore. Amen.
Amen.